good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining tonight. As Jen mentioned, Mayor Chisholm-Beaton had some remarks prepared for this evening's webinar. Unfortunately, she's unable to make it this evening, and our CEO, Juanita Spencer, is in Ottawa, Ontario. So I'll go ahead and read the prepared remarks from Mayor Chisholm-Beaton. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the incredible toll the recent wildfires have taken on our communities, on our emergency service providers, and on our natural environment. Nova Scotians have been displaced, have lost their homes, and some in the agricultural industry have lost their livelihoods. Part of climate adaptation is supporting communities to prepare for and recover from extreme weather events. I know I speak for all local elected officials when I say we want to do everything possible to ensure our residents receive this support. Climate adaptation and, increasingly, climate-related emergency management will continue to impact municipalities, requiring planning and investment. NSFM has been supporting municipal climate change efforts across issues ranging from infrastructure to energy. We've partnered with the province on many initiatives through our Active Transportation Committee, joint presentations on clean growth, and coastal protection, to name a few. NSFM will continue to represent municipalities through collaboration and advocacy in the multifaceted realm of climate action. The Department of Environment and Climate Change has introduced an updated climate change risk assessment with a twofold objective of assisting communities in addressing the effects of climate change and protecting resources that contribute to our well-being. Municipal leadership will play a critical role in prioritizing action. Flooding and wildfires are identified as the top hazards emerging over the next 3 decades. Some might say these threats are here now. Risk assessments don't spell out solutions. They do provide considerations for those collaborating to make our province more resilient in the face of climate change. That said, the following presentation will include information on resources available to Nova Scotian municipalities as they continue their efforts. For those elected officials on the call or watching the recording who are interested in working with NSFM on climate-related issues, the Climate Change Advisory Committee is accepting expressions of interest. You can reach out to Danny Coffey, who happens to be myself, at NSFM, or submit an expression of interest through the main NSFM email. Joining us today to discuss the climate change risk assessment and its impact on municipalities are Jen Organ, Engagement and Climate Adaptation Specialist with the Province of Nova Scotia, Gavin Kennedy, Climate Change Risk Assessment Lead and Hydrogeologist, also with the province, and Alex Cadell, Climate Services Specialist in a shared role between CLIMAtlantic and the Department of Environment and Climate Change. I'll turn it over to Jen now.
Thanks so much, Danny, for that. That was a great introduction. And we also really want to echo too, we know this has been a really challenging couple of weeks for Nova Scotia and some communities in particular, and our thoughts are with anyone who's been directly or indirectly affected by the wildfires. And thank you so much for making the time to be here on a Wednesday night to learn about this, really timely topic. And we really appreciate this opportunity, and thank you so much for NSFM for hosting this and providing this platform for us to reach your members as well. We see this as a really kind of a first step in connecting with some of you and what will hopefully be kind of start of maybe some future conversations or dialogue. So hopefully you'll learn something new today, and we'll also have some time for discussion and questions near the end. And it's great. Brenda already introduced some of our names and roles, which is great. I'll just say it again, I'm Jen Organ. I'm an engagement specialist here with the province, with the Department of Environment and Climate Change. And I'm joined here today with Gavin Kennedy and Alex Cadell, who will introduce themselves a little bit more at the start of their presentations. And we all work on the research and knowledge mobilization team as part of the climate change division of this department. And we're part of kind of a larger climate adaptation team And that team helps communities, businesses, and other levels of government understand and respond to the impacts of climate change in various ways through training, raising awareness, through different climate services, and you'll learn some more about that today. And we'd also like to acknowledge that we're in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and I'm calling in today from Shpuktuk, or Halifax. And yeah, we did want to just quickly go over a couple tech review. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with Zoom, so I'll just quickly go over some of the features of Zoom, because this will be not very interactive, but there will be a couple moments where you might want to mute or unmute yourself, and kind of engage in the chat and that kind of thing. So on the bottom left of your screen, which should be the bottom left of your screen, it's how it appears in mine, there is a little microphone, and you can mute or unmute yourself using that. We are asking people to keep your mics muted just during the presentation so that we don't get any feedback. I know I have lots of feedback if I'm at home and that kind of thing, so that would be great. But you can unmute yourself, of course, during the question period or during another time. And I also have the ability to do that. So if you can't figure it out, just write it in the chat and I can go and unmute yourself as well. There's also a video. So right next to that button on the bottom left screen, there's a stop video or start video. And you're welcome to keep that on or off. We are recording. Again, it will be primarily just for really the NSFM membership. But so it's up to you if you want to keep your video on or not. If you're finding the reception is kind of a bit choppy, then turning off your video might help that. So far things feel good on my end, so hopefully that stays that way throughout. And we will have, there's a chat on the right of your screen. And if you don't see that, I think on the bottom, there is a little kind of icon on the bottom strip for chat. You're welcome to use that and ask questions, including any comments as they come to mind there. We will be taking questions. We'll have time for questions at the end of the presentations. I think we should have about 15-20 minutes for questions and discussion. But if you have a question and you think you might forget, feel free to pop that in the chat and we can moderate that as well. Trying to think of any other tech things. We will have a couple polls that are going to pop up, and we'll let you know when that happens. And those are anonymous polls, and that's just an opportunity for us to receive a little bit of feedback and insight to help us with future presentations and our ability to share this information with more groups. Sorry. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about tech. If anyone has any quick questions about that, let me know. And again, you can write in the chat if you do need any help navigating that. Recording, we've done that. So yeah, so why are we here today? So the purpose of today's webinar is to really provide a bit of a high-level present on the high-level findings of the latest climate change risk assessment for Nova Scotia that was released in December 2022, and introduce you to CLIMAtlantic, Atlantic Canada's climate service hub, and resources available through there. And we'll kind of at the end talk a little bit about next steps and ways to reach out to us as well. So first, Gavin will present on the risk assessment, and then Alex will share. Sorry, Will, it took my throat. Alex will then share information about CLIMAtlantic, and then we'll have time for questions and discussions. So to actually kick us off, we are going to start with a poll. So I'll initiate that, and you should be able to see it on your screen. And if everyone can just take a few seconds to respond to that, that would be great. If you can't see that for some reason, the question is, have you heard of the 2022 Provincial Climate Change Risk Assessment? There's yes, but haven't read it, which is totally fine. Yes, I've read the report, or no, which is also totally fine. All right, that's great. So I think everyone's answered who wants to. There's kind of a good spread there. There's yes, but haven't read it. About 40% of us, yes, I've read the report, about 40%, and no. So it's a bit of a range here. So some of this might be new to you, some of it you might have heard already, but hopefully there's probably a little more detail in here than maybe you would read in the summary report. So I will stop here and pass it on to Gavin.
Thanks, Jen. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Doesn't have the halo there, so I was wondering. Okay. Okay, so yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm just gonna move my video out of the way. So as Jen mentioned, my name is Gavin Kennedy, and I'm the lead for climate change risk assessment with the Climate Change Division of the Department of Environment. And climate change. Today, I'm going to present a summary of the provincial climate change risk assessment that was released back in December. This is the first opportunity we've had to present this work to municipalities, so we're keen to hear about what you think about it. We're also presenting at the AMANS conference as part of the provincial update this coming Friday. So let's start with some background. Here's a graph that you may be familiar with showing CO2 concentrations over the past 10,000 years constructed from ice cores and CO2 measurements taken at a volcano monitoring station in Hawaii since 1958. The spike you see at the end of the record corresponds to the exponentially increasing human use of fossil fuels for things like manufacturing, transportation, electricity, and heating that emit greenhouse gases, which of course have a long residence time in the atmosphere, warming our planet and changing our climate. The effects of climate change are already happening here in Nova Scotia. These photos are from extreme weather events over the past 5 years or so. Fiona and the spring wildfire season are of course top of mind right now when we think about climate change impacts. In addition to the obvious damage to buildings and infrastructure, there's also gradual and less visible impacts, such as lost work for individuals, lost revenues for businesses, people experiencing food insecurity, kids not in school, people not making it to their health appointments, as well as impacts to our ecosystems. The Insurance Bureau of Canada said that Fiona was the costliest extreme weather event recorded in Atlantic Canada, with $660 million of insured damage. That figure, of course, doesn't even include the uninsured damage and the costs of the ripple effects I just mentioned. And that's just one storm. We don't have any numbers yet for this year's wildfires, but we can also expect some pretty high costs. A recent report by the Canadian Climate Institute estimates a decrease of about $2,000 a year in per capita annual income by 2050 from climate change in Canada. So how is our climate projected to change? Based on background literature and climate data projections under a high emission scenario, here are some of the big changes we can expect. The first is getting warmer. Extreme heat events will be more common, and Nova Scotia is projected to see average annual temperatures that are 2.6 degrees warmer by mid-century and 4.5 degrees warmer by the end of the century. Precipitation is also projected to increase province-wide by about 10% by the end of century. Combined with the temperature changes, we'll see a shift to less snow and more rain, and we anticipate that we'll see heavier precipitation over shorter periods of time and more frequent drought, which can exacerbate forest fire hazard. Warming oceans mean tropical storms can track further north without losing strength, which is what happened with Fiona, and we can expect these tropical storms to occur more frequently. We have a lot of coastline in Nova Scotia, and sea levels are rising. The projections are between 68 and 100 centimeters towards the end of century, depending on which part of the coast you're looking at. And that doesn't even include storm surge. Ocean conditions and other ecosystems are changing in other ways too, which will make it harder for species that live here now to thrive in the future. So here's a timeline of climate change risk assessment in Nova Scotia over the last few decades, showing the first analysis released back in 2005, followed by the municipal climate change adaptation planning work that many of you would be familiar with. And finally, the most recent risk assessment released this past December, which will be the focus of this presentation. The next risk assessment update is planned for 2025, and then we'll conduct an assessment every 5 years thereafter. So before I talk about the 2022 risk assessment, I just want to review some of the great work that was done as part of the MCAPs. All Nova Scotia municipal units completed MCAPs, which included the objective of evaluating risk and vulnerability related to climate change. And the focus of the NCAPs was mainly on public infrastructure, essential services, and vulnerable social elements of communities. Most municipalities applied the hazard risk vulnerability assessment framework that was recommended. Some of the top perceived hazards that emerged from the studies were heavy precipitation, major storms, temperature extremes, and coastal flooding. Some of the key results and findings of the MCAPs include the realization that a holistic approach that considers the different components of climate risk and how its impacts are interconnected is necessary to understand what adaptations may be needed. The figure on the right is an example of how risk was identified in the MCAPs for climate hazards, and this one's for flooding. Infrastructure such as roads and services such as wastewater collection and treatment were found to be especially vulnerable. The MCAP findings that climate impacts are interconnected, all aspects of risk need to be considered, not just exposure, and that climate change will impact people disproportionately were important in helping to chart the direction of our current approach to climate change risk assessment. So why do we do climate change risk assessment? Considering the pace and magnitude of changes to Nova Scotia's climate, it's important to regularly assess the risks facing the province. The research helps us to better understand not only how the climate is changing, but also the hazards and opportunities for the well-being of Nova Scotians. And it serves as an evidence-based resource for governments, businesses, communities, and Nova Scotians to guide action to help prepare and respond to the impacts of climate change. Next, I'll give an overview of the approach we used in the 2022 assessment. We used a framework developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to define climate risk, which reflects the interaction of three main elements. Climate hazard is how much the climate will change and whether it can cause harm to something that matters. Exposure is what's exposed to the hazard, which can include people, buildings, cultural sites, or ecosystems, among other things. Vulnerability is a combination of how sensitive something is and the capacity to adapt. So looking at an extreme heat wave as an example of a climate hazard, someone working outside during the heat wave is more exposed to the hazard than someone who works inside an office. And in terms of vulnerability, someone who can afford an air conditioner will be better able to cope and adapt during the heat wave than someone who cannot afford one. And lastly, someone with a heart condition is more sensitive to heat than someone that doesn't have those types of health issues. We used a well-being framework to explore how climate change impacts the essential resources needed for well-being along 5 different dimensions: natural, human, social, manufactured, which would include the built environment, and financial. We started the assessment with background research into how the climate is changing and the impacts for our well-being. We conducted novel research using a quantitative approach to create a well-being at risk index, which combines climate data with social, economic, and natural and built asset data. The analysis generated key findings and new insights, such as the identification of hazards of greatest relative concern, priority regions and groups, and issues to explore further, as well as opportunities. So as part of that background research phase, to help us understand the priorities of Nova Scotians and design the risk assessment approach, we did some qualitative investigations on what was important to residents, First Nations, and institutions, including municipalities. We did this work during COVID, and so our engagement opportunities were somewhat limited, but we did speak with 8 municipalities. Municipal priorities that emerged included infrastructure, economic development, social services, culture and community, and environment and sustainability. And a common theme was that municipalities are looking for adaptation opportunities that can address multiple priorities. We then looked at how climate change was interacting with these priority areas in Nova Scotia. So for example, Nova Scotia has some of the oldest public infrastructure in Canada, with much of it vulnerable to flooding. When the main hospital or road is damaged in smaller rural communities, they often don't have alternatives, and it's costly to repair. We've already experienced that in places like Cape Breton, with people having to drive 4 hours around washouts due to flooding. In terms of financial well-being, climate change will bring both losses and opportunities for fishing, forestry, farming, and tourism. Nova Scotia has a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly in rural communities, and these will face disruption from extreme weather events. So next, I'll give you a sense of the general scope of the Wellbeing at Risk Index. We looked at both low and high greenhouse gas emission scenarios, but focused on the higher emission scenario shown in red on the mean temperature over time graph. You can't really see the axes here, but you've got year and then you've got temperature on the y-axis. And that's appropriate for looking at long-term risk and is reflective of past emissions. This is known as Representative Concentration Pathway, or RCP 8.5, which is one of the scenarios we could face if we aren't globally successful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of the spatial resolution of the index, Statistics Canada census divisions were selected, which correspond to Nova Scotia's counties. We used a relatively high level of geography here because there was a lot of data to process and we were developing a new approach. We looked at 3 time horizons, near term, mid-century, and end of century compared to baseline. And in total, we looked at 19 climate impact drivers, such as floods or extreme heat, for the 2 climate scenarios and 4 time horizons, along with 175 indicators. And with the help of a consulting firm, we modeled the effect of the impact drivers on our well-being. We didn't look at frequency or intensity of storms or impacts to our oceans due to limitations in data availability and project scope. However, future updates will hopefully be able to consider some of these factors, and we'll be able to get more granular with our spatial resolution. So the 19 climate impact drivers came again from the International Panel on Climate Change reporting, and these are grouped into 4 potential hazard outcomes, which either increase or decrease our well-being. For the 2022 risk assessment, we did not have an impact driver for tropical storms, but did consider sea level rise and pluvial flooding. For each climate impact driver, we would turn on relevant indicators and calculate scores across the different elements of climate risk. And these were averaged to produce an overall relative well-being at risk score for the different scenarios, time periods, and counties. So let's look at some of the results. The Wellbeing at Risk Index uses statistical analyses to present ranked scores for the hazards to our well-being. This diagram shows the hazards of highest relative rank for each time period under the high emissions scenario. It's important to remember that the ranking is relative, but these hazards are expected to present more potential adverse consequences for well-being because of climate change. We'll still experience all the climate hazards, but these are the hazards that have significant consequences across Nova Scotia. The 2030s reflect much of what we're seeing now. Overland flooding and in lakes, rivers, and streams from heavy rainfall or snowmelt, shifts in ecoregions, increases in vector-borne diseases, Lyme disease would be one example, sea level rise, and coastal flooding. Why do these rise to the top? Because with the impact drivers we've selected, the vulnerability of exposed capitals is among the highest compared to some of the other hazards. By mid-century, wildfires along with flooding will be the greatest concerns. And by the end of century, extreme heat and high temperatures dominate the hazard rankings, with heat extremes impacting agriculture and transportation infrastructure, demand for cooling in buildings, ecosystems, and the frequency of wildfires. Heat becomes more of a driver for well-being changes because temperature changes are predicted to outpace precipitation changes over the long term. We're just going to pause here for a moment for a quick poll that I'll let Jen introduce.
Thanks, Gavin. So I am going to launch a poll. 1 second here, and I'll introduce the question. So there's 2 questions in this poll. So if you might have to scroll down using the bar to see the second one. The first question is, do these top hazards resonate with what you are experiencing or observing in your municipality? The answers, options being no, some concerns aren't reflected in this presentation, or yes. And the second question is your municipality considering these climate hazards in decisions and project plans? No, some of them, all of them, or you're not sure. So I'll give everyone a few seconds here to go through those and respond. It looks like everyone has responded who wants to. I'm just going to end the poll and share these results so everyone else can see. So the first question, it looks like for many, these top hazards resonate with what you are experiencing or observing. For some, no, and also some concerns aren't reflected in this presentation. Yeah, so it's interesting to see this kind of variation. And if people did want to, we unfortunately don't have time to kind of discuss, results, but if you did want to add anything in the chat or add anything to your response, if you're comfortable with that, you're welcome to, just to give us a little more insight, but thank you for filling those out. And the second question is your municipality considering these climate hazards in decisions and project plans? No one said no. Some of them, all of them are not sure. So a bit of a spread across some of them and not sure being considered. And also, again, if you do have any kind of additional comments or feedback in the chat about maybe how that's happening, that would be great. And if not, then we'd love to follow up about that too in a future conversation or chat, or maybe that'll come up in the discussion. Great, thank you for answering those. I'll stop sharing this now.
Okay, so we ran the same well-being at risk index analysis using the lower, more optimistic RCP 4.5 greenhouse gas emission scenario, and found that as with the higher emission scenario, flooding is a top concern until mid-century. The difference is that as we look towards the end of the century in this scenario, flooding remains a top concern for the RCP 4.5. So you can see a notable difference with respect to the impact of heat under the high emissions scenario, which is something we'll need to pay attention to. So climate change does present some opportunities, such as a longer growing season and less heating requirements. But these outcomes will need to be managed alongside the challenges that come with the opportunities. For example, more agricultural pests and more cooling requirements. As we begin to understand these opportunities, we need to intentionally plan and adapt so we can take advantage of them. And while climate change affects everyone, it won't affect everyone equally. Some groups will face disproportionate impacts of climate change. African Nova Scotians and peoples of African descent, Mi'kmaq immigrants, seniors, youth, women, individuals living on low incomes, individuals living with disabilities, LGBTQ+, as well as anyone facing health or other systemic inequities. These inequities tend to interact and influence where people live and their social and economic circumstances, which in turn can lead to increased exposure to climate hazards and vulnerability to impacts. As part of the risk assessment, we conducted statistical analyses and, combined with other evidence, identified opportunities for improvements that could reduce these vulnerabilities. Although all of Nova Scotia will be affected by climate change and will need to adapt, the analysis at the county level showed that some areas have a higher need to adapt, either to reduce risks or take advantage of opportunities. These include Annapolis, Digby, Halifax, Colchester, Cumberland, Pictou, and Cape Breton counties. Why? Well, it depends a bit on each region. Halifax, for example, is the largest county with the most people and infrastructure, which means exposure is driving risk. For Cumberland, the story is different. Not as many people, but the extent of climatic change is relatively higher than some other counties and has an older population susceptible to climate hazards. For Annapolis, it's a mix of opportunities and risks related to agriculture, which is a dominant part of the region's economy. I'll get into some more detail on these regional results over the next few slides here. So, looking at patterns of the different elements of risk for increasing negative climate effects to well-being, and this would include climate impact drivers such as drought, flood, heat, pests, and disease. For climate hazard, Cumberland County ranks the highest because this county will see some of the biggest relative changes in climate. For exposure, Halifax ranks the highest because it has the most people and infrastructure. For sensitivity to these negative climate impact drivers, again, Cumberland ranks the highest because of an older population. And lastly, for low coping capacity, Digby ranks the highest due to lower civic engagement scores, which could affect how they adapt and respond to climate impacts. When all these elements of risk are combined into the Wellbeing at Risk Index, we see which counties may have the highest need to adapt to increasing negative effects of climate change. Next, let's explore what this looks like for decreasing negative effects for well-being. So for climate hazard, Cumberland County ranks the highest again because of the larger relative climatic change, and that would include reduced heavy snowfall. For exposure, Halifax again ranks the highest because it has the most people and infrastructure and can take advantage of things like a lower demand for heating. For sensitivity, Cumberland ranks the highest largely because it has low perceived mental health scores in this county, which might improve with some climate changes, such as reduced heavy snowfall. And finally, for low coping capacity, Digby ranks the highest because it has the greatest potential for improvements to social capitals. When these elements of risk are combined into the Wellbeing at Risk Index, we see which counties may have the highest potential to take advantage of opportunities to improve well-being. So these examples just serve to illustrate some of the insights that we can generate using the Wellbeing Index. For each county, we've produced a regional analysis, and I'll just provide a snapshot of Digby County here. The analysis includes a summary of projected changes in climate and top-ranked hazards based on the county's attributes. So for Digby, the top hazards are cooling demand due to rising air temperatures, drought, pests, and heat extremes for agriculture. And just to give an example, a farmer in the Valley region might have to contend with the combined impacts of increased frequency of drought, pests, and extreme heat. The risk assessment is designed to help focus adaptation to mitigate these effects. So a farmer might consider shifting crop types, expanding water supply capacity, and investing in new pest management techniques. In response to more unpredictable weather, they also may want to consider producing more shelf-stable products so they can use fruits and vegetables that are damaged in unexpected weather events. So if you want to have a look at the risk assessment in more detail, we have published a series of infographics, a summary report and full technical report, and a series of county-level summaries, which are all available on our website. Having completed the risk assessment and related research, an overarching principle that emerged is that it's important to act to protect well-being in ways that don't compromise long-term sustainability for a healthy planet and healthy people. Some key priorities include we'll need to act on priority hazards, especially flooding and heat. We need to build capacity to adapt to all hazards because they change over time and interact. For example, in 2021, BC experienced drought, wildfires, and heavy rainfall on top of a heat dome, and each came in succession and made the following one worse. We'll need to address the root causes of systemic inequities to effectively reduce risks. There is a need to further explore risks at a more granular scale to guide local level action and within sectors. And lastly, our climate future is not written in stone, so it's important to continue to update risk information, which we'll do in 2025 and every 5 years thereafter. So how is the province addressing climate change? Of course, we need specific actions to deal with the source of the problem while reducing risks and taking advantage of opportunities. Back in December, Nova Scotia released a climate plan containing 68 actions across 13 departments, a number of which are related to climate change risk assessment. Municipalities are strongly represented in the climate plan through initiatives such as the Sustainable Communities Challenge Fund and resourcing for embedded climate change coordinators, which should help boost adaptation capacity. Other key resources which you're probably familiar with include the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which hosts a wealth of climate risk and adaptation information, and CLIMAtlantic. I think some of you may have connected with Alex in the past, who, as mentioned earlier, is in a shared role between the province and CLIMAtlantic. And I'll turn it over to him now to talk about some of the available resources and services.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. And I'll be brief here. I just have a few quick slides just to highlight some of what CLIMAtlantic does. We thought this would be a useful addition to the conversation about the risk assessment here today, because we know a lot of municipalities are looking for support with understanding and adapting to climate change. So highlighting some of the services that are here in the province available to you seemed useful. So if you haven't heard of us, CLIMAtlantic is the climate services hub for Atlantic Canada. We're part of a national network of other regional climate services hubs and connected to the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, so well supported on that front. And really, we're here to provide free support to communities and organizations across the region to help them understand climate impacts and build capacity to respond. So for everyone in Nova Scotia here today, I am the person that you can reach out to for support. So hello, we can go to the next slide there, Gavin. Wonderful. So if you're curious about what types of services might be of interest, again, municipalities or any other organizations that you're working with can reach out to contact myself or my colleagues at CLIMAtlantic for a wide variety of support related to climate change adaptation. That might include support for accessing and understanding climate change data and getting some guidance on how it might be useful for decision making. We can help to connect you with resources or expertise that exist in different places across the region. We do work to develop and share climate adaptation tools. We do work on addressing knowledge and research gaps that come up from all the people that we talk with. Deliver training, particularly if you have new staff that you're trying to bring on board or try to have people build their own expertise in climate change, climate impacts, climate adaptation. We're here to help them on their journeys there as well. We do a lot of communications and engagement work. We have a really quite fantastic monthly newsletter with funding opportunities and articles about things that are happening across our region. If you haven't subscribed to that already, I'd encourage you to check it out. And we do provide support for adaptation funding applications as well. If you're looking for guidance on questions that have to do with climate change impacts and adaptation and just want someone to talk it through with, that's something we can help out with as well. So if any of that sounds interesting, again, you can find more information. If you forget who I am, you can find contact information on our website as well, which is just CLIMAtlantic.ca, CLIMatlantic.ca. And I've just got one more slide here for you. Again, just highlighting some recent initiatives on our end that have been specifically focused on providing tools and resources for municipalities in Atlantic Canada that I thought might be useful to highlight. So these include things like a coastal adaptation toolkit. This helps to identify appropriate site-specific adaptation options, both engineering and land use planning, to address coastal flooding and erosion concerns. And we know some of your colleagues in municipalities across the region have started to use that and have had good luck with the results there. We have a networking map that identifies organizations across the region that are doing work related to climate adaptation. So again, it's easier than ever before to understand who's doing what work around you and to reach out to expertise in your region. Very shortly, we're launching an adaptation library that houses documents with adaptation information specific to Atlantic Canada. It's not live yet, but I was just chatting with some of my colleagues yesterday, and we're anticipating it will be available on our site by the end of June, so very near future here. Some other things to be aware of. We recently worked with East Coast Environmental Law to prepare a report that explores potential sources of municipal liability for considering, managing, and disclosing climate change flood risks. And I know that's top of mind for a number of municipalities around the region at the moment. We also just recently released a report on managed retreat that examines some of the effects of managed retreat policies, as well as identifies potential approaches for communities that are considering retreating infrastructure or houses or whatever that looks like from vulnerable coastlines. And finally, we do maintain a regularly updated list of funding opportunities for climate change adaptation projects on the CLIMAtlantic site. So if you have a project idea in mind and are looking for what funding might be out there, again, that's a place to look as a first pass, and again, reaching out to our staff for assistance as well. So if you weren't aware of any of that, hopefully that is a useful, very quick overview. But again, if you're doing any work related to climate change impacts and adaptation and want to chat more, always happy to do that. Don't hesitate to reach out.
So thanks, Alex. And I will include in a second the links to CLIMAtlantic in the chat, and also the link to the county level profiles that Gavin mentioned. And we'll make sure to send those links out to maybe in a follow-up email, and I'll talk to Danny about that as well, just so you have some links on hand. So for next steps, please connect with us if you want to learn more about climate change hazards and the risk assessment. If you'd like to provide feedback on the 2022 climate change risk assessment, which will help kind of inform the design of the 2025 risk assessment. So we're both kind of sharing this risk assessment out, and at the same time thinking about how we can improve and maybe adjust the next risk assessment as well. And also feel free to reach out. We'd love to explore opportunities for our team to share this information at the local level, or if you want support in sharing risk assessment results with any groups in mind. And also we'd like to kind of think about kind of what other tools or types of support would make it easier to share this information or learn about climate change risk and adaptation if you yourself or your colleagues or other municipal members or community members are hoping to share this information with their audiences. And our contact information will be on the final slide. So that will be on the slide, but again, we'll send that out as well after. We do have other engagement activities planned, and we're still very much in the planning phase. This is really kind of one of the early phases of engagement. And they will include a range of municipal audiences, including our colleagues at Municipal Affairs and Housing, elected officials such as yourself, planners, other municipal staff, where we plan to have more focused conversation about municipal issues of concern related to climate change risk. So like Gavin said, we're presenting the AMANs at the conference on Friday, and then we're hoping to have some more follow-up, kind of maybe more deeper conversations, maybe with fewer people, or, if you wanted to meet one-on-one, then we're happy to chat about that as well. So as a final poll, we have one more poll. This next poll will help us get a sense of kind of what you think would best support you or your municipality in integrating climate change and climate change risks into municipal decisions and plans. And this will help give us a bit of insight into kind of for us and also our partners as we're looking to think about how we can best support things through resources, tools, and other kind of supports. So I'll give everyone a few seconds to fill those out. And this one in particular says select 3 options only if you can, but it's okay if you selected more. Okay, so I'm going to end this poll here. So for looks like again, spread, of course, funding coming up at the top there. And then next to that, examples of best practices, connections with other municipalities, lessons learned, guidance documents, and expertise or skill sets. So yeah, this is great. And seeing the connections with other municipalities and examples of best practices, that's kind of aligned with what we're hearing from other sectors as well. So yeah, it's helpful for us to see this. And of course, we might, kind of ask, follow up with some questions around that when we're having maybe follow-up conversations with any of you. Oh, sorry, I didn't share that poll, but there, so you can see the results here. So I will stop sharing this now. So we do have time now for some questions and discussion. I think we have about 15 minutes. Maybe we'll say 14 minutes because I like to do a quick closing at the end. So if anyone does have any questions, feel free to, sorry, Noble, I saw your comment there. The poll is not shown, so hopefully everyone saw that. So if anyone would like to have any questions, and Gavin, I think just the way that you're sharing your screen now, I don't know if I can see if people are raising their hands or not, if they're using that function. So I don't know if it's okay if you can stop sharing your screen now. Great, thank you.
Jen, did you want to stop the recording before the questions, or?
Yeah, Danny, what do you think? Should we, or are folks comfortable keeping the recording on for questions and discussion, or we prefer to have it off now?
And leave the recording on until the end, I think is fine.
Okay. Okay, great. So we can open it up. Oh, I do see a question here. A second here, sorry. So someone has a question. We mentioned that, hey Mike, you mentioned that the action plan includes funding for embedded climate specialists, and what does that look like? So I believe that's part of the climate plan funding. And so I think through CLEAN, they are in the process of identifying what communities will receive climate change coordinators, I think they're calling them. I can follow up with more details about that. And those coordinators will support really implementing climate change actions in their communities across municipalities. And that's part of a larger bucket or other funding as well that also comes with funding to actually be able to implement those actions. That's kind of, funding for the actual implementation can be hard sometimes. So, but we don't know yet what communities are receiving that. It's just, I think, in the process of maybe being finalized with CLIM. I'm not quite sure, but. Anyone else have any questions? You're welcome to just pop. I think we're not a huge group, so you're welcome just to pop on and unmute yourself if you do have a question, or the chat's fine too if that's more comfortable.
I guess I have one other question, Jen, not to monopolize the questions. Are you guys planning, you mentioned obviously that you've determined specific municipalities or counties that, or census divisions, I guess, that are at higher risk or have higher opportunities or more prevalent opportunities to potentially take advantage of. Are there intentions for you guys to actually meet with those municipalities specifically, like on a municipality to like kind of like on a one-on-one basis at all?
Gavin, did you want to respond to that one, or?
So Mike, you're asking if there's a plan to do more deeper engagement with municipalities on a one-on-one basis?
Yeah, like specifically those ones that were identified as being as having a higher risk or higher hazard level.
I think all municipalities have a need to adapt, so we're not we're not singling out any specific municipalities for targeted, I guess, engagement. I think we want to engage with all municipalities because they're all going to need to prepare and respond to these effects of climate change. But yeah, we're open to any conversations, and we do plan, I think Jen mentioned, a range of different types of municipal audiences, from staff planners to administrators to elected officials, to try to reach out to everyone with the message.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Gavin. Norval has a question. Any discussion about other gases that affect climate change, for example, methane gas from cattle? I don't think that's something that we've been directly involved with, but Alex, I'm wondering if you've been hearing that just through some of your work?
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly. So on our end of things, Norval, we are really just looking at all of the impacts of climate change. So all of the modeling that goes into how Nova Scotia's climate is changing, that considers all of these factors. So I know Gavin just showed the carbon dioxide chart there. We would also be looking at methane, at nitrous oxide. And again, methane comes from cattle, certainly, but also other sources, wetlands and natural sources, fluorinated gases as well. So if it has a relevance to climate change, it's considered in the models that we're using to understand how the climate is changing and relating that to our region. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think all greenhouse gas emissions are considered in those models, not just CO2. Sometimes the methane is converted to a CO2 equivalent for the purposes of showing kind of the increasing trend, I think. But yeah, absolutely, methane would be considered.
Thanks.
Thanks, Norval, for the question. Gavin and Alex. I don't see other questions in the chat. I'll give it another minute though. I'm personally looking forward to kind of learning more about, because I haven't been involved in a lot of municipal conversations, but how municipalities may be kind of considering some of these things in planning currently, and also supporting potentially some of those like lessons learned and best practices pieces that may be helpful as well for their municipalities to hear about. But no worries if you can't speak to that tonight. But
just a question: when the carbon tax kicks in on July 1st, is that going to affect your research and reporting?
I don't think so. For our team, the adaptation team, and Alex or Gavin or anyone else on our team, feel free to pop in if I'm not. I had to follow up with that response, but I don't think that will affect our team's work. I don't think that will change the direction of our team's work. And yeah, but I might have to think about that, I guess, a little bit more in terms of the broader climate change division. I don't know if I'm the best person to speak to that from our team, but I don't know if anyone else has anything else to add to that question, but.
Yeah, no, I would echo what you're saying. I don't think it'll have any impact on our group's work.
It's kind of, it can be a little bit complicated. There's two different kind of teams as part of the climate change division, and we work really closely with all teams. But so our team is adaptation, and there's two other teams. There's another team that's focused on the climate plan, strategic plan, or sorry, implementing the climate plan, and another team focused specifically on mitigation, including greenhouse gas emissions. And so that team is, I guess, much more specialized in that area and would know more details about kind of more the nuances of that. So if you do have questions about that, we're happy to pass on their contact information, or you can follow up with us for sure. Any other questions? I don't think I see any hands up. I'm just triple checking. Well, maybe I'll close this off. I don't want to rush, but I also know it's a Wednesday night, so people are happy with ending a couple minutes early. Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us tonight. And really, if you would like to follow up with any questions or opportunities for us to maybe come present to your group, or just have some conversation about, you know, if you have any questions about the specific data or more about, you know, sharing this information or learning more about that, please be in touch. And in terms of making sure I'm not missing anything from my closing notes, but I will try to, if I don't get to this, I haven't been very good at including things in the chat, and sorry, Alex and Gavin, for some links. But what we can do is we can follow up, maybe Danny, with you, and include the slide deck, the PowerPoint presentation, and the recording, along with the links that we've mentioned today. And that way people can easily kind of find out more information that way, or connect with us if they'd like to. If that
That'd be
sounds good.
great. Yeah, thanks so much. And just on behalf of NSFM, thank you to Jen, Gavin, and Alex. And we did distribute the Coastal Adaptation Toolkit through our Monday memo, and we're happy to keep sharing information that comes from, you know, from your department as it relates to municipal climate adaptation. So we will definitely share this presentation broadly, and anything else you forward.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jenny, and everyone at SFM. And yeah, we're looking forward to connect more. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting us.